This week's Torah portion, I guess I should say once again, this week's Torah portion offers us one of the most challenging stories in the Torah. Second, maybe only, to the Akedah, to the binding of Isaac. It retraces the death of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu. Aaron is Moses' brother, and some Torah portions ago he was elected as the high priest. He and all his family and all his descendants were to be the Kohanim, the Kohens, and they were to serve the Jewish people as priests. And we pick up the Torah portion on the 8th day of a celebration that started with the completion of the tabernacle, the sanctuary, the transportable sanctuary in the wilderness that is going to accompany us all the way to Jerusalem and the Promised Land. And we finally finished building. We're still at the foot of Mount Sinai. We haven't moved. Not yet. But we have been celebrating, dancing, singing, but also, since this is the beginning of the priesthood, we have been doing a lot of barbecues. In other words, this is the beginning of the animal sacrifice rituals. And so every day, more and more animals are brought to be offered up. And especially on this 8th day, which is the day of completion, a great offering is brought to the newly created altar. And the story goes that a fire came forth from the divine presence and consumed at once all the offerings from the altar, and the people fell on their knees in awe of the sight. And this is the exact moment where we don't exactly know why and how Nadav and Avihu, perhaps moved by this fantastic apparition, this fantastic sight, decide to grab a couple pans, set them on fire, throw incense into them, and the Torah text continues saying, they offered before the Eternal strange fire, which had not been enjoined upon them. And once more a fire came forth from the Eternal and consumed them. Thus they died before the Eternal. We can only speculate, really, what was Nadav and Avihu's intention in doing what they did. We can only speculate as well as to the true meaning of this story. But you can imagine that with a story like this, a lot of ink over many, many centuries and many generations has been spilled, trying to give us the keys to understand this difficult story. Overwhelmingly, however, even through the ages, the rabbis seek to teach and want to teach us that the most important lesson from this passage is that we should never stray from what is being commended, what is being enjoined. That we should never try to innovate, especially not in areas of worship practices. That we should not take spiritual matters into our own hands, and rather we should embrace the time-honored, God-given rules and practices and our tradition. And the truth of the matter is, in the face of it, looking at the story on a literal level, we might say that this rabbi might not be so wrong. After all, there is some sense in getting to this kind of a conclusion. That in fact, perhaps innovating, and especially maybe in the way that Nadav and Avihu have done, might lead not only to the death of several individuals, but we may risk losing the soul of Judaism itself. Yet you know how it goes in our tradition. As soon as you have a bunch of rabbis saying A, you're going to have a bunch of them also saying, well, B, but also you should look at C, D. So you obviously find the exact opposite conclusion, who would argue with the rabbis and say, lack of innovation, rather than being a means to support and survive, may in fact be what in the long term may prove to be Judaism's demise. By remaining stuck in our ways, by refraining from evolving with the times, we may in fact find ourselves becoming obsolete and extinct. I'm going to suspect that we've had this debate for a very, very, very long time. I'm going to throw a dart in the timeline of Jewish history and say that perhaps, though I'm sure it happened before, the first time we can tell for sure when such debates came to be was at the times we were exiled in Babylon. Our temple had just been destroyed. Our way of life had been overthrown by Nebuchadnezzar and his soldiers. We were thrown to the other side of the Middle East, perhaps never to return again. And there was a time where our sages sitting in Babylon might have argued with each other, what should we do going forward? How can we save this people, this nation, and its practices? Perhaps we should innovate. Perhaps we should take a drastic, incredible path to compile, put together all the stories of the oral tradition that has been ours for hundreds of years and put them together in one scroll. And after many debates, they did. And in the 70 years of our exile in Babylon, the Torah was born. And when we came back to Jerusalem, we came back holding the scroll of our Torah in our arms. The same story happens again with the destruction of the second temple, this time 600 years forward, in 70 CE, when the temple is destroyed by the Romans. And our sages at this time, they are now called rabbis, are going to meet together to, again, figure out how are we going to be able to survive the diaspora? How are we going to be able to survive this destruction? And yet again, the debate arises. Should we innovate? Should we create something that has never been created before? Out of the ashes of the temple, should we bring to life a new form of Judaism? And in doing so, should we couch on paper the oral tradition that has come forth in the past 600 years since the Torah came to be? And the answer this time was yes, we should innovate. And the rabbis began a process of writing what is today called the Talmud. Over generations, over another 600 years, rabbis are going to argue and fine-tune what Judaism is going to look like. The Judaism we more or less know today was born in those times. The way Judaism is practiced today would not be recognizable by those who lived at the times of the temple. They would not call this Judaism. Not all innovations went well. At the turn of the first millennium, just a little after, a rabbi called Moses Maimonides decided it was time to bring Judaism into the evolving philosophy of the Greek. The Greek philosophers were coming up with magnificent way of looking at the world, and Maimonides decided Judaism would be a fabulous match to these theories, to this new rational way of thinking that was unheard of before. And he wrote the Guide for the Perplexed, thinking he was going to, yet again, help Judaism innovate and move into a different direction. Well, that didn't work out quite well. His books, wherever they were found, were burnt and rejected. And it's going to take another 700 years before Judaism brushes past rational thinking again. Instead, what happens is that rabbis begin to anchor down and codify everything to make the practices unified throughout the Jewish galaxy, if you'd like. And that is going to be the case until the 1600s, where the impulse of innovating burst forth once again on the stage of Jewish history. This time with the Jewish mystics. This time with the Kabbalah. This time with Isaac Luria and his followers in Tzfat, in northern Israel, the city of Safed, where there is this incredible energy buzzing in the hills of the Upper Galilee. And these students and these teachers are going to forevermore change the way we worship. To this day, they added songs and prayers and mantras and pictures on prayer books, drawings to help get into altered states of consciousness. And I'm talking Orthodox prayer books. And those were never taken out. To this day, the Friday night Shabbat service is based on the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria and his follower. There didn't used to be a Friday night Shabbat service. It was only Shabbat morning, Saturday. And then in the 1700s, from a debate, the opposition between those who wanted to innovate and those who didn't came to a violent place, came to a violent time. The Gaon of Vilna in Lithuania, what was at the time the Polish Commonwealth, the Gaon of Vilna asked his disciples to oppose with all their strength, and oftentimes violently. There are even few cases of people being killed in the fightings that went on in the streets. They opposed vigorously and vehemently the disciples of the Baal Shem Tov in the 1700s, who created the Hasidic tradition, because they innovated in ways that were unconscionable to those mitnagdim, those opponents. They brought joy to the synagogue. How dare they? They discarded the Talmud to concentrate on saying the Torah and the Torah only. How dare they? They brought in ecstatic prayers and ecstatic dancing, meditation, study of esoteric teachings in Kabbalah. And the two clashed in ways we had never seen before. But if you thought this was going to be the end of it, what happened in the 1800s has to this day impacted us as a Jewish people. In the 1800s came the time of what's called the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment. Everywhere in Europe, people broke free from the rules of the kings and created here and there nation-states, democracies. France, England, Germany. Things began to shift. And as those nation-states were born, the walls of the ghettos, the walls around the villages and the shtetls began to fall away. And some Jews, mostly the wealthiest of them, began to venture out behind the walls and to intermingle with their Christian friends. And they saw this world that was being born, words of philosophy and reason and science. And they wanted to be a part of it because they were highly intellectuals from hundreds of years of studying the Talmud, and they were very well educated. And so they gravitated towards these new things they started to call universities. And they just couldn't get enough of it. And in Germany especially, the Jews began to demand, or ask, not demand, beg would be a better term, their Christians overlords to let them become Germans, to let them participate in the unfolding of the nation. They wanted to let go of their ancestral dress. They wanted to let go of Yiddish only speaking and began to learn German. They wanted to let go of their ancestral tradition and begin to draw nearer and nearer to adopting those of the Christians around them. Some of them, led by another Moses, Mendelssohn, began to organize and began to open synagogues. But right there, they were attacked by their Christian neighbors saying, well, are you for real? Do you really want to be part of Germany? Because what we see is that every time at the end of Passover, you say this little sentence, next year in Jerusalem. So are you here to stay, or are you about to leave? Is this the fatherland for you, or is it not? So these Jews decided to rename their synagogue to send a message to those Christians that they were here to stay, that they were not going back to Jerusalem. That phrase was actually deleted from the Passover Haggadah. That they were not going back to rebuild the temple. In fact, they renamed their synagogues temples to show that the temple was here. It was in Germany. We were going to stay here. This is home now. And what happened inside of those newly called temples was that they did away with any Hebrew. All the prayers, and even the Torah. Moses Mendelssohn is the first one to translate the Torah in German. Even the Torah was only in German. All the prayers were only in German. The yarmulkes were banned. Prayer shawls were banned. The rabbis wore top hats and long-tailed black coats. They moved the bimah, which was in the center of the sanctuary, erased that, and moved it to the front so that it would look exactly like the Lutheran church down the street. And besides the cross, no one would be able to tell the difference between this building or that building. That was called, and is still called to this day, though it has continued to evolve, Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism was born in the early 1800s in Germany. And you can imagine the outrage that many Jews felt seeing how far to the extreme they had gone to assimilate and to become like those Germans. But those who thought that it was too much to the extreme, but still didn't want to go back to the shtetl, didn't want to go back to the ghetto, decided they were going to find a middle ground. And so a rabbi in Germany in 1850 or so published a book. Rabbi Hirsch published a book that was the book that founded in Germany in 1850 conservative Judaism. Because they needed something in between. But that was still outrageous for many of us. And there were those who found that still too extreme, too much to give up. But still, they didn't want to go back to the shtetls or to the ghettos either. So they founded just a few decades later, a few years later, another movement in Judaism, which we know today as modern Orthodoxy. Orthodox Judaism was born in Germany in the 1850s and 60s. as a response to all the other groups that were being created. And then they all turned around, looked at those who were still in the ghettos, looked at those who were still in the shtetls and said, well, you guys are now going to be called ultra-Orthodox. And to this day, this is the battle that rages in our home. This is the divided house that we have inherited from that time of evolution, from that time of moving forward, from that time of trying to figure ourselves out in this new world that was born around 300 years ago. But from that time, we've also faced a major Jewish crisis of identity. Because until then, we all were what we will call today ultra-Orthodox. But we didn't have a word for it, we were Jewish. But since then, we have so many different ways of being Jewish that we don't really know who is Jewish now and who is not. And what does that really mean? So there's a little piece of the warning that the ultra-Orthodox might say, watching all of this diversity unfold in front of our eyes, saying, look at the risk you have taken. Look at what you have done. We are assimilating in greater and greater numbers. The Jewish people is slowly disappearing. In fact, though Nadav and Avihu's death was instantaneous, but our death seems to be ongoing. It seems to be slowly taking place over a few generations. We should and need to fall back and rediscover, re-embrace our traditions, our rules, our laws. There was something really good about those walls around the ghettos. It kept us intact. But of course, there are those, a few here amongst them, who would have just argued the opposite. Still to this day argue the opposite. Judaism might have actually been dead by now had we not found ways to evolve and offer those who may not have been able to relate to an ultra-Orthodox way of life a place to go, a way to still be connected, not as extremely as we used to, but in some ways still connected. But look at what's going on. We haven't stopped this debate. It is ongoing. And it is also ongoing beyond the frame of Judaism. We seem to be at a cusp. 300 years later, 300 years ago, consciousness evolved into rational thinking. The age of the Enlightenment. Modernity came to be. We live in an era where consciousness is evolving again towards post-modernity, towards a new way of being. And what we are seeing is exactly what we saw 300 years ago in Judaism. We are seeing a lot of different paths forged ahead, multiple paths forged ahead, not only in Judaism, but also in our nation and in our world. But we are also seeing a lot of resistance. We're also seeing a lot of people who are saying, my values are being threatened. My way of life is being threatened. And I'm going to go and fight against anyone who will threaten those values and this way of life. In our nation so far, it manifests through a critical political wrestling right now. In the world, unfortunately, it manifests through war, displacement, and a lot of bloodshed. But make no mistake, this is the exact same debate that all of us have been having. The point is that we are uniquely positioned, maybe as Jews, because we have seen it before, to look at all the sides that are warring, all the sides that are so afraid. And instead of rejecting one in favor of the other, we can sit and embrace and recognize the dilemma, recognize the fear, and not demonize those who are collapsing, perhaps, walling themselves off, for sure. And lend a hand instead of a fist. Because the story of Nadav and Avihu is telling us that there is great danger of a great fire if we fail to do that as a people. So all of us are called upon to do our little part, to engage with those who may not think like us, instead of unfriending them from our Facebook. I'm serious. To read the tenets by which they work and live, to understand their perspective, to sit with them around the table, at family dinners, at community dinners, and to deeply listen and acknowledge that everybody is right from the perspective through which they look at the world. And nothing you can do or say will change that. So let's be the ambassadors of understanding. Let's be the ambassadors of welcoming, so that they might ultimately move down their guard a little bit and choose a path of peace.